always ends? Sons killing their mothers? Your fathers?
No. We will be the gods we choose to be.
God of War is one of the most important, monumental franchises in all of gaming history, especially for M-rated games, and a clear indication of this is that it's only one of two major PlayStation franchises to have survived more than one or two generations. Most PlayStation studios will work on a series for one generation, maybe make a sequel on the next, and then stop and move on. Examples of this are Resistance, Infamous, Uncharted, Jak, and Sly Cooper, but God of War and Ratchet & Clank have managed to go strong from the PS2 all the way to the present day, with both series being alive and well. But this didn't happen without a few changes. For example, Ratchet & Clank got a soft reboot on the PS3 with a future series, followed by yet another reboot in 2016, and God of War got the same treatment just 2 years later. The series was very beloved on the PS2, PS3, heck, even on the PSP, with practically every entry being kept in high regard, and the series being one of the most consistently impressive from both a technical standpoint as well as in terms of quality. After God of War Ascension in 2013, it seemed that, though the series was very good and many were still enjoying it, it had gotten less astonishing after 6 whole entries all had the same gameplay style and similar mythological elements. But only 5 years later, a full-on reboot of the series was released, moving the franchise into Norse mythology rather than Greek, with Kratos being redesigned and given a son. As is the case with practically every reboot, I'm sure this originally turned some heads and ruffled a few feathers, but once the game came out, it became an instant classic and was regarded as one of the best titles of the generation and decade. I've heard a lot of people say that God of War is like the PS4's equivalent to The Last of Us, which is quite understandable. Even though it didn't release at the tail end of the console's life like that game, which is a title that can instead be awarded to its sequel and Ghost of Tsushima, it did amass over 20 million sales as of 2022, was possibly the biggest critical darling of the year, and even won Game of the Year at the Game Awards, which is actually credible because that was before the TGBs existed. Considering how much I love The Last of Us, it would be criminal for me not to give this game a chance. So even though I originally gave up on this game a few hours in and opted to play through Horizon Zero Dawn instead back in 2019, I finally dedicated myself to beating this game and taking a deep look at it. There is, however, one aspect I didn't have to look into very deeply in order to understand its quality, that being the visuals and presentation. God of War is one of the best looking games of all time, and I don't know if anyone can really disagree with that. Previous entries in the franchise always looked quite good, but with the new cinematic perspective, not only during cutscenes but during gameplay as well, it really shines here more than ever before. The game is very realistic with its art style, but just like most PlayStation exclusive, it fills its world with awesome and unique enemies that have creative designs. The Last of Us has the Cordyceps infected, Horizon has the jaw-dropping machines, and this game has... I don't know how to even describe these things. From the undead tree things with poison bubbling inside their bodies, to giant dragons, knights with the most inconveniently long swords in existence, and absolutely awesome dark elves. Every single enemy type and character in this game is unique. There literally isn't a single character here that looks similar or acts similar to another. Even the two brothers, Brock and Sindri, look nothing alike, which is pretty hilarious, but also highlights the incredible level of creativity within this game and its visuals. Without even getting into the worlds and realms, the enemies you face in this game are memorable in their own right. Giant werewolf-like enemies with wolverine claws, creepy and mysterious revenants covered in dirty rags, weird slug-like enemies that burrow underground, and even enemies with weaponry and shields made out of ice.
Ice is nice.
I can remember all of these very easily, and the way you fight them has a clever link to their design, helping you keep track of specific weaknesses for each of them. Does this enemy move too fast for you to use melee attacks? Use some range moves. Does this one like to hide in the dark? Use some light arrows. Does this one use ice attacks? Use a weapon that burns. Every single one of them is incredibly unique, and even though I'm not big into mythology like many people, this game really infatuated me with all of its creatures, not only because of how well they've been brought to life with their hauntingly beautiful designs, but also because of how memorable the ways you fight them are. God of War's phenomenal characters and worlds bring the realistic visuals to new heights, making it feel very different from other games. It's clear that they put tons of effort into the art design for this game, because even though it looks like real life, it brings you to so many fantastical locales that it truly transports you to another world. On top of this, the game is entirely done with one camera angle. It's all a continuous one take through gameplay and cutscenes, of course considering the free control you have of it while playing. This is probably the biggest thing setting the game's presentation apart, and I love it. It allows for so many seamless transitions that don't need to cut away from the gameplay, but rather seamlessly weave through it to keep the flow constant. Of course, this isn't nearly as hard to do in a game as in a movie, but bravo in every considerable way to whoever had this idea, because it allows for some of the smoothest movement from gameplay to QTE, gameplay to cutscene, or cutscene to gameplay. There's so much beautiful variety in every realm you go to, with every enemy you encounter, with every boss you fight, and with every character you speak to. It's an absolute technical marvel. Not to mention the incredible music, which is uplifting, powerful, and memorable in every sense of the word, combining every aspect of the culture it's representing to create very fitting music that works with the game perfectly, but also stands on its own as absolutely exceptional. But if any of you have ever heard of a game called The Order 1886, then you should know that good presentation doesn't automatically get a game off the hook if it's not good to play, and God of War 2018 has quite the monumental shift from its series roots. While the originals were really fun beat-em-up style games, the reboot goes for a far more intense, yet far more free experience with more ways to screw up, but more ways for you to outsmart your enemy. It's the living and breathing definition of weighty, satisfying, and impactful. You may get repeatedly beat down, but it still gives you a feeling of power over your enemies with the incredible weight of every single one of your attacks. Even though you can easily get combos going like the old games, that's not the goal here. Rather, it's about evading and striking very strategically and landing the right moves on the right enemies at the perfect time. An easy enemy is not too awful hard to take down, as pretty much any move will work on them. But as elemental enemies, enemies with strange techniques, and enemies that enter specific attack patterns are introduced, you will constantly be switching around your arsenal of possible moves to get the upper hand. Some enemies can only be killed with some weapons, some need to be stunned before they can escape you, and some are just complete a-holes. But despite all of the variety in the enemies, it never gets to be too much, because each of your weapons serves an express purpose and has important advantages that aren't too tough to keep track of. Even though it may be daunting at first, you'll quickly discover how to flow these different moves together seamlessly and what the appropriate tools for certain foes are. Not only does your axe have a light throw and a heavy throw, but you can also directly hit enemies lightly or heavily, and combining these 4 moves in different ways is where the fun really ramps up, and as you gain access to new skills, things just continue to get more interesting. You know, when I first played this game, I stopped after just a few hours because it started to get repetitive. But it took until now for me to realize that I was just playing the game wrong. In order to get the perfect experience from this game, the skill tree is an absolute must. If you don't get new skills, you will not only get your butt handed to you by enemies, but you'll also be reliant on the same moves. And even though that might sound like a complaint, it's actually one of my favorite unique aspects of the game now that I've beaten it. Most games have a skill tree that is cool and somewhat helpful, but you don't really get the feeling that its effects will have a massive impact on your experience. However, God of War allows you to access some of the best moves in the entire game through skills, and I honestly couldn't imagine my playthrough without these. They're so incredibly helpful to the flow and intensity of combat, and it adds to the true sense of progression within the game. Not only do the characters progress higher and higher through the 9 realms to get to the highest peak, but the player simultaneously gets more and more powerful through the entire journey, going from rags to riches and getting comfortable with every combo and technique. The incredible sense of progression that you'll get from this game plays a larger role in its world, story, and difficulty alike, but by itself boosts the combat to a legendary level. It may seem a bit slow at first, but it manages to catch up to the speed and mobility of the older games while amping up the intensity and impact that this new style brings. 2 special moves for Kratos, 3 weapon types, specials for Atreus, stat boosts that recharge over time, different types of arrows, and even different handles for your blades can make or break every encounter. The skill level of your foes may seem daunting at first, but over time you'll be given enough freedom to fight back and take them down. In general, the difficulty of this game is one of its biggest achievements, but also its largest flaw. I think the challenge offered during the main story and many Midgard side missions is perfect at giving the player a lot of satisfaction once they conquer their foes, as you'll really have to think through their attacks and weaknesses to get the upper hand. There aren't many battles whatsoever that you can just breeze through, and that's a testament to how strategic the combat is. But on the other hand, there are multiple parts of this game where the challenge spikes incredibly hard, leaving you with a lot of satisfaction once you beat it, but a lot of frustration that doesn't feel like it's happening as a result of your skill level, but because of problems with the balancing of the game. I love how this is one of the very few games I've played recently where it's almost always very tough, but very fair at the same time, giving the player enough options to overtake their foes, even in the toughest of situations. If you're losing, chances are there's a piece of the puzzle you're forgetting, and once you gracefully add it into your furious blaze of attacks, you'll rise to the top. But at the same time, there are some areas where this idea is completely abandoned. During the main story, there really aren't that many parts that have me dying constantly unless I was just being an idiot. I mean, sure, the fight in Tyr's temple against the 2 knights is very tough, but once I got down to the strategy of their attacks, I managed to dispatch them pretty quickly. There is, however, one part of the game that is complete and utter BS, and if you've played it, you probably know what I'm talking about. The Gauntlet Between the Realms. This is like a lot of the game. Challenging, but doable, except for the Alfheim battle against the 2 Dark Elves. The problem with this fight is that these little pea-brains love to fly up in the air and cloud your vision so you can't even see, meaning you can't very often get attacks in on them, especially if they're both alive at once. I died again and again and again to them. I even threw in the towel and waited until the next day to try again, but eventually, I did it on my first try using the Chaos Blades. I had been using the axe the whole time and failing over and over because all the walkthroughs said that the axe was the best weapon. So yeah, thanks a lot to them. But in all seriousness, this battle is extremely cheap and unfair, and I only beat it because I got so much practice. So if you're about to go up against this part, make sure you're prepared and make sure to use the weapon that best fits you. This fight, alongside many side missions like the Niflheim Mist and Muspelheim Trials, is indicative of the game's largest flaw: unbalanced difficulty. I'm not just saying that it's a problem because I don't want the game to be hard. In fact, I do. It is hard and I love a lot of it regardless, but these parts take it way too far and don't give the player a challenge that feels deliberate, but rather one that feels like a result of someone having a cool idea for a fight, putting it into the game quickly, and forgetting to check if it was totally fair or balanced. And in general, there are some enemies with attacks that feel ridiculously out of place and unfair. I already talked about the Dark Elves, but the Hellwalkers also have an attack where they can freeze you and immediately get an insane number of hits in, which not only happens way too quickly and efficiently, it's in general just the most infuriating type of thing for a game to do. Whenever an enemy grabs onto me and just wails on me non-stop, there's nothing quite like it to make me want to scream. Looking at you, Balls 3D. Outside of that, though, the gameplay in general is phenomenal, allowing you access to multiple creative realms, some of which are reserved entirely for the post-game, with each of them offering a very unique style and look that makes them feel alive. From the depressing, clouded Niflheim deprived of any life not yet corrupted by the Revenants, to the fiery hellscape of Muspelheim, which feels like a living indication of the doom that shall befall all other realms when Ragnarok comes, to the actual underworld, which is very different from other depictions of it, that is Helheim. These worlds aren't always shown to have inhabitants, but whether they are or aren't does nothing to hamper the incredibly distinct attributes each of them has that make them stick in my mind as some of the coolest fantasy worlds I've seen in a game. If you look through God of War's gameplay as a whole, it's incredibly fun and has a lot of great mechanics that flow together well. And even though the fast travel system is cumbersome and the difficulty is sometimes inconsistent, especially with the side missions, it's enjoyable to go through the combat and beat the crap out of your enemies, solve really intelligent but never cryptic puzzles, and discover the ins and outs of these incredible worlds nevertheless, creating a game that's much more than just nice to look at, but incredible to play. The final important thing to take a look at with this game is, of course, the story, which many have lauded as one of the best of the entire generation, and even one of the best of all time. It's clear that this is the main inspiration for the constant comparisons to The Last of Us, so let's see if it manages to compare. If you know me, you'll know that I adore the stories of both Last of Us games, and even though they take clear inspiration from other works, they stand on their own due to their incredible themes and believable characters who perfectly represent said themes. So I'll come right out and say that I take no issue with this game's heavy inspiration from the first Last of Us game. In fact, I commend it. That story is so incredible and well made that other games were inevitably going to be inspired by it, and I think that's great. The game follows Kratos, who has removed himself from his old life and run off to the north, then having a wife and son in the process. He has completely shed himself of the title of God in favor of being a husband and father, and has tried to deprive his son of any knowledge of his past in the hopes that he won't go down the same path. Eventually, though, the mother dies and they must bring her ashes to the highest peak in all of the realms to fulfill her final request. It's somewhat similar to the first Last of Us, but I believe the detail of Atreus being Kratos' biological son, rather than just a child he's entrusted to take care of, really does have a major impact on the story. Joel does hide his past, just like Kratos, but he's pretty open about the 25 years in which he was a brutal murderer and smuggler. He simply hides his daughter's death, whereas Kratos wants to avoid any mention of his previous evils. It's a detail that at first seems minute, but as the stories progress, it's very clear to see how different they are. The hereditary connection between Kratos and Atreus not only brings Atreus closer to his father than Ellie is to Joel, but also closer to repeating his mistakes. Of course, they both end up doing this, but Atreus is never without Kratos' guidance, and in the end it's a learning experience for both of them, rather than just for the younger one. Kratos and the player may not be totally connected, but if you've played through some of the older games, you'll also get the feeling of shame for what you did, and so the sympathy that the player has for Kratos is immediately understandable, and helps the story further explore the theme of family and learning, showing that both the child and the father in this plot need to grow and understand each other better. I'm not going to completely spoil it, but the villain also has a connection to this theme that is pulled off in a plot twist that feels incredibly natural and doesn't even try to be shocking with how it's presented, and yet it is. The direct lines we can draw between the hero and villain's different journeys with family, as well as the similarities between them, are one of the strongest, most unique aspects of the story that allow it to really resonate with many people who have made mistakes with family, misunderstood someone close to them, or not recognized the signs of manipulation, as the representation we see of manipulation and abuse in this game story is incredibly realistic and well done. Whether you've lost family due to your own mistakes or due to something out of your control, this game tells a powerful tale of the effect that a bond with others can have on us, and how losing or gaining that bond can really shape who we are and become. It's one of the most graceful stories out there due to how fluidly it connects to gameplay, yet still feels more subdued than when it needs to be. The gameplay is very rarely slowed down, yet the story is and still manages to flow perfectly into everything else. The characters, the themes, and the dialogue are all sharpened to a T to deliver comedy, seriousness, drama, or tragedy whenever both necessary and natural. It goes to a lot of dark places, but never shows them off in a pretentious way or in a manner that feels like they're just trying to use these things to be shocking, which is a very common problem with most stories. It's strictly focused on the journey, just like Kratos, and even though there are so many details to appreciate along the way, it's only once we get to our goal and complete the game that we can look back upon them, or review them if you will, that we can truly recognize their quality and beauty. It's a magnificent story within an incredibly well-presented game that manages to feel just like a film, with all the incredible editing, music, camera work, visuals, characters, and emotional impact that you'd expect from one, but combined with the incredible mechanics, fun exploration, intense yet satisfying combat, and jaw-dropping worlds that you'd expect from a video game. It's not a masterpiece in my opinion, but neither was the first Last of Us, and in fact they both suffer from a similar issue. But the important thing is that both of these games have left a major impact on the games industry, with their artistic quality and passionate creativity shining through any flaws to make for an incredible, unforgettable, and generation-defining experience that I am proud to have gone through.
You will always be a monster.
I know. But I am your monster no longer.